Class number 7, and today we'll discuss divergence and desynchronization of regime dynamics in new independent states and territories with problematic sovereign status. I'd like to start with posing a question about post-Soviet polities. Right at the beginning, for quite a long period of time and till now, quite a number of political scientists, politicians and general public treated new independent states and territories with incomplete sovereign status as post-Soviet polities. And even now, sometimes they are being called post-Soviet polities. But this was a fairly misleading identification, even then, with all its formal relevance. And it continues, and it is even less adequate now. As you know from the general overview that we've made during our classes, polities are quite different, and there's no one general pattern of explanation for that. And actually this identification, this name, ignores fundamental differences between the polities that emerged after collapse of Soviet Union. And I'm using this wording, polities that emerged after collapse of Soviet Union, that not necessarily post-Soviet, and for quite they cannot be very simply termed or classified as post-Soviet, and for a number of reasons. The fact is that differences, even in this regard, were quite evident at the very beginning. Some polities accepted their identity as post-Soviet very easily, and there wasn't much debate about it. Some clearly rejected it, and we can cite examples of Baltic states, for example, Georgia at the very beginning, or Moldova, who very clearly challenged this definition, this identification, and even say as far as Baltic states are concerned, for example, they claim that they are restoring their previous statehood and consider a period of Soviet rule as a kind of a digression, colonization, whatever, as something unnatural in their history. So they wouldn't identify themselves with this period anyway. And some were uneasy about it. Well, for example, Ukraine was very uneasy about it, and some other states. Some, as I said, accepted it. Even say in case of such states as Kazakhstan, for example, and some other Central Asian states, they were not, very happy about the dissolution of Soviet Union, and they were still thinking about Soviet options as something quite viable for them. So there was a variety of identifications, and this variety of identifications shows that even then, in late 91, early 92, polities were quite different, and they were perceiving themselves, politicians and citizens in those polities were perceiving them as quite different. But the problem was that it was very difficult to find a clear identity. If you remember when we were discussing the first stage of transformation and consolidation, the initial stage, the initial phase, as we were calling it, we said that the issue of identity, of national identity, was top in the political agendas of all those states. So all of those states found it quite problematic to identify themselves. So it's not strange at all that no clear identification either for the group nor for individual polities or groups of polities could be found. Of course, in this context and from this perspective, we have to apply a broader analytical interpretation that may account to differences between the polities that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And actually, this class of ours would be devoted to attempts to define those broader analytical interpretations, because we cannot be satisfied with the literature which is giving us a very simplistic, I would say, answers, applying to all the polities some classical transit formulas, transit patterns, uncritically, or which just accepts or buys this primitive definition of post-Soviet and tries to explain all the polities as polities that have to do with the divorce with the Soviet Union, and all their specificity is limited to this important but single aspect of their development. What I'd like to suggest to you, and what I propose that we do during the class, we search for what I term chronopolitical properties of the states that succeeded Soviet Union, that emerged after dissolution of Soviet Union. What are those properties? To put it in a more simple way, they are evolutionary and historical properties that may account to the differences between post-Soviet polities. During the first classes that we had at this course, we already went through a fairly long period, more than a millennium, a fairly long period of political evolution through a fairly long historical period, and we saw that there are quite a number of important events that took place during that time, and at critical junctures of development through this millennium, there developed fairly stable institutional frameworks that remain valid till now, probably in a modified form, very often in a modified form. Some of those institutional designs that have been developed during the history of Russia and other neighboring areas actually have been redefined and reshaped several times. But anyway, with all those reshapings and redefinitions, they still are quite valid, and we have to take them into consideration. So the idea is that we have to consider all those historical properties. Of course, those evolutionary and historical properties have been accumulated over time. And the question is, how do we account to this accumulation? It's one easy thing which we can do right now, to refer back to what we can find in history books, to refer back to material which we mentioned during our initial classes. But this is essentially, this is all descriptions. That's a descriptive aspect of the whole thing. But how to organize this description into a pattern which can serve comparative purposes, which can be used as an analytical framework. How we can identify and analyze those properties. And to do that, I would suggest that we apply a fairly well-known instrument. Since 60s, it's being employed in political science, and it is called funnel of causality. As you know, first, it has been introduced in Michigan Political Science School by Converse, Campbell and their colleagues, Particularly in the book called American Voter, they introduced funnel of causality to explain voting behavior of American citizens. And since then, a number of other political scientists, for example, Sabatier did it for policy, development of policy options, and this funnel of causality has been used in several schools and several subdisciplines of political science. The last one, which I'd like to mention, is a pattern, a model developed by my colleagues from МГИМО and also my colleagues from Institute of Comparative Politics in Bergen University. This model has been used for analysis of transition processes. So just a few words about the structure of funnel of causality. The primary goal of the funnel of causality is to show that actors' strategies and actions are shaped by a range of causal relations over time, and not only to enumerate those causes, and not only to give, so to say, uncritical laundry list of those causes, but also to establish a kind of a logical temporal sequence of those causes. Temporal not only in terms of real time, but also functional in terms of relative time, what is being called relative time, and what I call chronopolitical aspect, chronopolitical dimension. A number of potential outcomes is lowest at the bottom of the funnel, or at the stem of the funnel, at the bottleneck, if you can use this metaphor of funnel of causality. And this leaves actors with a decreased number of strategies. So here on the screen you can see the funnel's structure. That's a pattern which I just used from the writings of my colleagues from Bergen, and they frame. Here's the key transition action, or say any actions. This can be elections. This can be a decision-making point. So somebody is making an action or making a decision here at this point. What are the causes for this action? And all those causes are framed, are put into this pattern of the funnel. We have broader and more distant part of the funnel. Then there are narrower and narrower sections of the funnel which come closer and closer to the section. So from this point of view, you see that the number of potential outcomes is lowest at the bottom of the funnel, yes, or the stem of the funnel, and leaves actors with decreased number of strategies. So finally, at the final outcome, an actor has a fairly limited number of strategies. He can choose from 2, 3, 4, I don't know, half a dozen options probably. But if you follow the whole funnel, you would see that the number of factors that actually influenced this limited number of options that were at hand at the moment of decisions were much broader, much greater. And the problem is how to establish relations between them. So my colleagues believe that at the far end of the funnel, structural variables are more important, while here closer to the very action are the factors that can be linked to agency. So this famous distinction between agency and structure. Structure is more important here at this end, and agency is becoming more and more important here. And they clearly, and I would say naturalistically, identify those layers. We call it layers of funnel. So this broadest layer, they attribute macrostructural variables to this layer, purely structural, while here where voluntarism is becoming essentially important, their actors appear with their structuration contexts, which are very much agency thing. I think we can use this type of funnel to explain post-Soviet. I criticize this name, but I'm using it as a kind of a label, as a very simplistic label. You understand it very easily. But what I suggest to do is that we do a somewhat different thing. I believe that agency and structure exists on all the layers that we observe. The question is the relative importance of agency and structure on each of the levels of the funnel. And also it's not only their relative importance, and I do recognize that my colleagues are right, that the agency aspect is getting stronger and stronger as we move from upper levels to bottom level, to the very decision-making moment. But I think that this also has to do with the dimension of both structures and agency. While here at the level of key decision-making, usually it's a very narrow circle of people who are making decisions. Decision makers are actually act there, and we can clearly identify them as actors. They can be naturally observed. Sometimes it can be even one person making some historical decision, like a president or a prime minister making final decision on some options. Or it can be a corpus of citizens making decision during, for example, the voting. But this actor, so to say, collective actor, also could be very easily observed. It's a limited number of people, even quite big, probably several million, but fairly limited. They can be physically identified. You can have lists of people who were making decisions, so this could be made very easy. But the further up we go, the actor is becoming more and more generalized. So at the utmost levels of funnel of causality, those actors could be treated in terms of historical generations of people. You cannot naturally observe them. You cannot have complete lists of people. So it's a more general tendency. Same is true about structural patterns. We can at the further ends of funnel of causality, we can speak about very general patterns. For example, like cleavage structures, very general cleavage structures that emerged probably centuries ago in this or that country. While when we are coming to the bottleneck of the funnel, to the stem of the funnel, we can see that those structural properties are fairly well defined. They are very concrete, same way as we were speaking about agency. We can speak about specific institution. This institution is, for example, election of December 2007 in Russia. Not just Russian elections in general, but one specific election with the very specific structural properties of this election. But if we move further on, we can already start to speak about elections in Russia, we can start to speak as structural patterns, we can speak about Russian constitution, we can speak about some other institutional properties which are of a more general nature. So that's why I suggest to you that we take into consideration for our purposes as a most distant aspect major geochronopolitical cleavages from the 9th century on. And you remember when we were discussing how it all started in Kievan Rus, how it all developed. We paid quite a number of quite a lot of time to those historical cleavages, and then we considered how those cleavages changed over time, what have emerged during this process. I also would like to say that institutional patterns of modernization from 19th century on are quite important. Why we single out middle of the 19th century for Russia and for what later became Soviet Union, and for all this corpus of polities which we unwillingly call post-Soviet. What's your idea? Why middle of the 19th century? You are quite right, because it was the period when a meaningful modernization process started in this country. Because all other institutional changes that were taking place from Tsar Boris Godunov, or from the times of early Romanovs, or from time of Peter the Great, particularly Catherine the Great and Alexander I, they were all westernization processes or Europeanization processes. They had to do with the very superfluous attempts to imitate or to follow some aspects of European politics, particularly related to military developments, to development of some administrative structures, and so on and so forth. So it was a very limited imitation and even simulation sometimes that couldn't have a fairly far-reaching results. Although, of course, reforms or revolution actually undertaken by Peter the Great made a very profound aspect, but it was not a modernization process anyway. It was, as we saw at our first class, it was just a purely typical for Russia for its historical development process. What we can observe with the beginning of the so-called Great Reforms, after the Crimean War, there started Great Reforms. There was undertaken emancipation of serfs in Russia. There was legal reform, there was administrative reform in the country, and a set of other reforms, very important reforms. And this was the first time when the meaningful process of modernization started. And actually, from this point, the essential agenda, revolutionary, so to say, agenda, which later led to creation of Soviet Union and which later resulted in collapse of Soviet Union and so on and so forth, it was formed exactly at that time, with a split into what was called then educated classes and uneducated classes, and which later became a split into westernizers and people who would behave in an isolationist way. But of course, all those terms are very relative and do not properly reflect the actual situation. But this cleavage, this modernization cleavage, was quite important into actually the agents of modernization and the objects of modernization. Most of the population was not. That was the tragic side of modernization process that started in this country. That the body of the nation was divided into two parts. the active agents of modernization and objects of modernization, people who passively were introduced into modernization, and this has changed over time. This was redefined several times, but this cleavage is still valid for present-day Russia, and not only for present-day Russia, but for most of the new independent states that we're discussing in our course. Then we also have to come to a more narrower, so to say, level, which has to do with policy options for state building since 60s. I'd like to remind you that when we were discussing in our class the Soviet legacy and existence and the so-called segment stateness within Soviet Union, we mentioned that since 60s there were very significant developments, both in terms of trying to revitalize and to make all those simulated or sometimes real structures of segment stateness to actually work. You remember conflict of two policies we were discussing, a policy of nationalizing and internationalizing policies, and all this type of stuff. So since 60s it was fairly important, and that's why the next layer in our funnel of causality is related to the 60s. What is also important for this period, for this layer, is the beginning, the emergence of the trend for structural or systemic degradation of Soviet Union. You remember we also discussed this, and here I'm just reminding you of the topics that we were passing by in our course of lectures, and now we are putting all those topics into one single analytical device. So in this analytical device, the structural or systemic degradation of Soviet Union also is related to this layer of 60s. That's where it started actually. That's where it became evident. And of course we are coming to a closest layer, which is policy options for perestroika. We also discussed it. There were several options. There were options that were linked to reform and transformation of the Union, of the Soviet Union. And of course there were options which were linked with the direct departure from the tradition, actually overcoming this tradition or destroying this tradition. In actual fact, the second option prevailed to an extent, I'd like to stress, because whatever we find in this funnel of causality is always present, and I'll try to clarify this at our next step. But before doing this, I'd like to draw your attention to this key transition action. This key transition action, as we already mentioned it in one of our classes, and as we'll repeat again today, was December 91, when the Soviet Union was dissolved. This is a point of departure for us. But we also have to take into consideration that in a number of polities, segment polities, this process was either going ahead or was lagging behind. And we'll return later on to this aspect when we'll start to speak about synchronization and desynchronization of changes, and to see whether those changes were synchronized or desynchronized. As I say, December 91 was a relative framework adequate for all the polities collectively, but for each individual polity, and this focus may be shifted either slightly before or slightly after, or may coincide with December 1, but this differed, which also accounts to differences, divergences within this whole area of new independent state and territories with incomplete sovereign status. So, before we proceed, I'd like to introduce to you a very interesting conceptual and instrumental innovation. And this instrumental innovation has been done actually by a person you know quite well, who was giving you another class this year. And this person is Professor Andrei Melville. He suggested that we can put together two funnels, and to put them together with their bottoms or stems or bottlenecks, whatever you prefer to call them. And they're linked to one focal action, like we discussed, for example, December 21st. So one funnel leads up to December 91, and the other, or another, actually, funnel leads out of December 91. So from this point of view, we can call one part of this instrumental device as funnel of causality, the one which leads to decisive event, to December 91. And the funnel which extends from December 91, of course it's not funnel of causality, it's funnel of something else. Funnel of what? What we can analyze? We can analyze events that followed from December 91. We can analyze, using this funnel, we can analyze effects of action taken then. Because in December 91, theoretically speaking, in abstract way, for example, a decision could be taken to maintain Soviet Union and to re-establish it on a different basis, for example. So different effects would have emerged if such a decision was taken then. So if this new funnel analyzes or helps us to analyze effects, we can call it funnel of effectuality. Of course, it's a neologism. It's probably sounds funny, but to my ear, I'm already accustomed to it. It sounds quite normal. So I hope that in a while, using this instrument, you would also get accustomed to this name, funnel of effectuality. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make a picture of this thing for presentation this time, but well, I think it's very easy task. You can even actually do it yourself, and you can analyze or see effects that can be analyzed there. You will see that we can single out close effects, distant effects, very distant effects, and so on and so forth. So this introduction of this instrument actually broadens our vision, and we can link together to broaden this vision, as I said, two funnels, funnel of causality and effectuality. It helps to prove that all those polities have very different traditions that funnel of causality helps us to do, and development options that cannot be limited to their common synchronization within Soviet Union. Of course, Soviet Union synchronized or tried to put practices, political practices and institutions of various segment states, various territories, or various groups of population, ethnocultural, first of all, groups of population, into one single system that would impose its own logic, and not only impose its own logic, but impose its own rhythms of development, its own temporality, if you wish. So from this point of view, of course, all those polities were synchronized by the Soviet structure, overlapping Soviet structure. But this synchronization was not strong enough and couldn't overcome desynchronization or differences existing between different territories and why it happened, we actually discussed during one of our previous classes, and I wouldn't repeat you again all those arguments and give you all those facts which explain this. What is even more interesting in temporal terms of analysis is that we can clearly see from this analytical instrument that events that were taking place after December 91, by very definition, by the very logic of this device, should be different in different republics. And the further we depart from December 91, the greater is divergence and the greater is desynchronization. Although I'd like to say that we shouldn't disregard synchronization that may emerge and that actually emerged at some stages of development, and convergence practices, but these were related rather to development of sub-regional links between specific polities, or some specific type of relations that were developing between a number of politics, because as you fairly well know, there developed some kind of sub-regions. They existed before, but they developed in a more consistent and clear way after December 91, those sub-regions within the area that we study. So within those sub-regions, there may emerge, and there actually emerged, a tendency of convergence and synchronization. To say we also shouldn't disregard synchronization trend that is easily and very naturally induced by general globalization trends, or particularly for the western part of the area that we study, for example, trend of European integration. Of course, it provides effects of synchronization, limited synchronization, but in some cases quite visible and quite effective, as well as convergence. So when I'm stressing, and this is definitely the focus of our course, we are concentrating on divergences and desynchronization processes within the area, we also have to acknowledge that there may be, and there actually are also, convergence and synchronization tendencies as well. And so probably a more careful analysis would demand to consider both and to see the balance in each specific case of both tendencies, of synchronization and desynchronization, conversion and divergence. But also, when we're speaking about synchronization and convergence, it's quite important also to identify the point of reference. What is the point of reference? Because for the Soviet period, it was quite clear what is the point of reference. Point of reference is Soviet Union and general framework of the Soviet Union, political framework of the Soviet Union. Now, after the Soviet Union has been dissolved, we have a number of rival points of references. And as we already mentioned before, one of the points is actually European point of view of United Europe, and it's more and more evident that this is quite valid and quite important point of reference for changes that are happening in this part of the world. This is also a point of reference which is or can be linked to Russia as the major successor state, and actually the only one formal legal successor state of Soviet Union, if we take, for example, United Nations or some other international treaties and so on and so forth. And then Community of Independent States is also important frame of reference. But besides all those frames of references, there are also individual frames of references of individual countries, as well as some regional frames of references. And as you know, they developed a number of alternative regional groupings. Some of them are quite strong, relatively strong, like Shanghai Organization, of Security, and some of them are fairly weak, like Guam and some others. Anyway, but there's a number of options, and some of those frames of references are actually very specialized. They are sometimes functional. They are having to do only with economics or, say, customs regime or things like that. So they are relevant only in this regard. So we have a variety of points of references, and it depends on your specific interests, or say the matter which you are studying, which frame of reference you have to take into consideration, and probably using different frame of references you can make different judgments on what is the balance of synchronization or desynchronization in the area. So again, December 91 is a focal point, and it is actually an event which is in the bottleneck of the two funnels. And in our analytical framework of funnel of causality, we can explain long-term developments up to December 91 and funnel of effectuality so far explains short-term developments taking place after it. But what is even more important, unfortunately this is outside our course and I cannot talk too much about it, but intellectually it's very tempting also to use this instrument and to try to see what might be not only short-term developments, but medium range developments, or probably long range developments, to try to make some projections, to make some guesses, to make some evaluations. And I believe that with all the difficulties that we confront in the process of evaluations of trends of development, funnel of causality helps us at least to achieve some degree of reliability in making those evaluations. So I'd like to formulate here a hypothesis. The hypothesis would run as following. The thicker is the historical substance within the funnel of causality. You remember, we have this funnel of causality, we have layers, and it depends what stuff is there on each of this layer. You remember there are structure and agency on all the layers, at least in this version of funnel of causality, which I'm trying to use here and now. They're both structure and agency, and but that means that we can evaluate each layer of funnel of causality from the point of view of development, elaborateness, thickness of structures used there, whether they are elaborate, complicated, complex, and from this point of view fairly well established, or they are thin, they are rather unsettled, uncertain, vulnerable, and so on and so forth. In the same way, we can evaluate the agency that was acting on each of those layers, where this agency was conscious enough, was consistent enough, was active enough, whether this agency managed to do the historical work that it had to confront very systematically, energetically and effectively, or whether the agency was actually skipping over important issues, worked for partial solutions or no solutions at all, trying to avoid responsibility, historical responsibility, I mean. So we can make all those evaluations. And making those evaluations, we can see that certain layers of the funnel of causality were well developed or less developed, better developed or less developed, whether they were thicker or thinner, both in their structure and in their agency potential. And while making these evaluations, we can see that they were either fairly well filled in layers, or there may be layers with certain holes, to speak metaphorically, or certain defects in their historical work, deficiencies, and so on and so forth. So my hypothesis is that having those deficiencies and holes would not definitely produce, but would provide a fairly high degree of possibility of having the same type of deficiencies, holes, deficits in future on relative levels. But this is only a projection. This is only an ideal picture. This is only an evaluation, as I said. And having this picture in mind, we can compensate for possible defects, deficiencies of the processes, structures, institutions that we have to develop. So from this point of view, this instrument, this double funnel of causality, is also a very important practical instrument that can be helpful not only political scientists for making evaluations and projections, futuristic projections, but also for politicians and citizens to evaluate the importance of this or that policy options, because policy options could be related not only to immediate tasks that they see in front of them, but also policy options should be evaluated and should be considered from the point of view of possible deficiencies and possible defects of institutional or agency structures of the future. So we can work to avoid problems that our sons and grandsons and granddaughters would have to confront in future. So now let's come back to December 91 and other issues. I have a table here. Unfortunately, this table is not very clearly seen on the screen, but try to concentrate. Here's a list of 23 polities that we consider, both new independent states and territories with informal or incomplete sovereign status. And here are some of the important formal actions that could be taken to start the process of state building, of independent state building rather. not just state building. We're not discussing segment state building. We're discussing independent state building. So what are those stages? It's declaration either of sovereignty or independence. And you see here that in some cases there are two declarations. One declaration of sovereignty within Soviet Union, which was quite typical at the initial stage, when polities, segment polities, were claiming they are sovereign polities, although they still remain within Soviet Union, or their status within Soviet Union is not clearly defined. Then at some stage they said that no, we are independent polity. And then declaration of independence followed. But I put them all together into one rubric with this distinction. I think it's the first important step is just to declare, to make a statement that you are sovereign or independent. In many cases, and I think we also have to take this into consideration, special acts, sometimes it's coincided, but sometimes there were special acts related to renaming of the polity. If you give a different name, that means you identify your polity in a different way. So change of name was also quite important, and that's why we have the whole set of change of name, rubric of change of name. Then establishment of new symbols, state symbols. Sometimes they were established in one moment, a new flag, a new anthem, a new coat of arms, and so on and so forth. That there's a variety of symbols that could be used. Sometimes they were established. New symbols were established by one act. Sometimes there were several acts establishing each individual symbol separately. But I have one single rubric for that. And I think it's also quite important. Then we also have, here's this rubric of new symbols. In some cases we have a very specific thing like restoration of the old constitution. Also, I would like to say that in many cases it was not a single moment of restoration. Sometimes the constitution was declared restored, probably sometime together with the declaration of independence or sovereignty, or by any separate act. But of course, it was necessary to adopt at least one, but sometimes a series of laws. They have to develop separate legislation on how you restore constitution, how it is being this restoration is being done, how this is to relate to existing legal practices, existing legislation, and so on and so forth. So that's why very often there was a series of actions related to that, and we also have to identify. In some cases, like for example, as I mentioned to you in previous classes, in Baltic states, for example, they were quite serious about it, and they made a fairly elaborate legislative base for restoration of old constitutions. Although situation also differed in all the three states in this regard also to quite an extent. But for example, in Georgia, they made the declaration, but they did very little to actually work for restoration of the constitution. So it remained rather declaration than the actual restoration of the constitution. So this may differ quite a lot, and quite a lot depends on the dynamics of this process. And that's why I have here a rubric of provisional constitutional law, which is valid both for restored constitution and for the cases where polities were working still under or within the framework of Soviet constitution. In most cases, this Soviet constitution was highly amended, amended to such a great degree that it was already something fairly different. But still, they had to develop some provisional constitutional legislation. And this also has to be taken into consideration to understand the dynamics of the process. Then we have one more rubric, and this rubric is beginning of constitutional process. So at some stage they had to start, with the exception, of course, of the cases when they were restoring all the constitution, in case they were working for a new constitution. And, for example, in Georgian case, they are both. At some stage they restored the constitution, but then very quickly they understood it wouldn't work, so they decided to develop a new constitution, so it can be combined. But generally speaking, we have two big classes: one with the restored, one with the Soviet, so to say, framework or some other framework. Here we also have to consider beginning of the processes of constitutional process, and usually this constitutional process is linked to establishment of some specialized body, like constitutional commission or some other body. It can be a parliament, but in most cases it was a separate body established by the parliament, in most cases, which worked for a period of time and produced various drafts. All those drafts were discussed within this body, but also outside it. They were discussed publicly. So constitutional process has also its own phases, its own elements, which, strictly speaking, we have to consider in each specific case, in case of which, in each polity. But here we have general rubric, but we can put under this rubric, say, some, in case of necessity, some other facts too. Then I have here rubric draft ready, to identify when the work of these commissions, if it succeeded, because not in all the cases. For example, in Russia's case, this draft was never ready. At some stage it was President Yeltsin who just said that forget about it, I'll give you a draft. A very similar situation was in Ukraine, but we'll have to also to consider it specifically in each case. But this moment, I think, from point of view of general dynamics, is quite an important one. Then we have a constitution approved by legislature, because in some cases there was a prior approval of constitution by legislature, which was something like authorization of draft for referendum. In some cases there were no such stage, but to understand whether we had such stage, when it took place, how much time it took, and so on and so on. For example, if you take the case of Armenia, the draft was ready in April of '94, and it was only more than a year after, in May of '95, that the legislature actually approved it. Of course, in the meanwhile, it was amended again, both on initiative of the legislature, of the president, and other bodies. But anyway, you have to take this into consideration in Armenian case, for example, quite clearly. While, for example, in some other cases where legislature wouldn't make any specific decision on that and wouldn't consider this draft at all, are also such cases we can find in our list of countries, and we also have to recognize it. And then finally comes the approval of the constitution. This approval could be done either by referendum or by legislature. In most cases it was referendum, in most cases, but in some exceptional cases it was legislature who made the decision on the constitution. So also the very difference between the two ways of approving constitution is quite important, and also timing is equally important. So from this point of view, we can say that here we can build another funnel of causality. When I'm stressing that the funnel of causality we are using is related, its bottleneck, its stem is in December 91, it's a funnel of causality aimed to general evaluation of general political development of those polities, of those new independent states and territories with incomplete sovereign status. But for any specific reason, we can build a different funnel of causality. And for example, here for constitutional process or formal attainment of state status, as I call it here, we can also build our own funnel of causality. Of course, all those steps here, which are here in this table, are steps fairly close to bottleneck. Fairly close. Of course, we have to consider more distant layers of this funnel of causality, and they are related not only for constitution efforts, for example, during the Soviet period, because there were constitutions. There were several, in most cases, there were several Soviet constitutions, 2, 3, sometimes 4, in exceptional cases. Of course, it has to do with, in some cases, with constitutional processes that was going on in interwar period outside Soviet Union, for example, Baltic states. It has to do with constitutional process that happened in some countries also during the period of civil war that overlapped, that overwhelmed Russian Empire and led to creation of Soviet Union. And this also has to do with the legal traditions that were established in earlier periods, particularly if you remember the bigger funnel of causality since the middle of the 19th century and also earlier ages. So we can build an alternative funnel of causality if we are interested, for example, in formal establishment of polities and getting constitutional status. So similar things could be done as far as other institutions are concerned. For example, if you are interested in studying legislatures, or you can develop your own funnel of causality. If you are interested in studying our institution of head of state, then you'll develop funnel of causality, which leads to first the appearance of the first head of state in an individual polity you are studying, with various steps leading up to it, like the decision to have presidency, nominations of presidents, elections or selections, or whatever was the procedure to find the guy, or just it was a transfer from a position within the Soviet structure into a presidency, purely technical transition, and so on and so forth. There may be different options, but within this funnel of causality, you can place all those things and to see the difference between the polities, because in none of the cases the procedures were exactly the same. We can do also the same, and actually this is most typical thing. We can use funnel of causality to study electoral processes, to put the bottleneck of the funnel of causality to what is called the founding elections in the transitological literature, and to see what effects led to founding elections, and what causes led to founding elections and determined it, and what were outcomes of founding elections, its effects upon the emerging political system, upon the further elections that we can see in the country, and so on and so forth. So that's strictly speaking properly speaking, the method which I'm trying to describe to you. This is the instrument which I'm proposing, and I would like to say that using this instrument we can solve different type of research structures, research tasks, as well as we can also use them to find answers to some practical challenges of actual politics around us. But whatever we do with all those funnels of causality, in each of the examples which I was giving to you, we see quite clearly that there was an ongoing process of desynchronization and divergence within the community of the emerging 23 polities. And this is the fact which we have to take into consideration. And at our next class we'll see what this desynchronization and this divergence led to. Thank you.